Hey guys, what's up? Erik, Jared, and Mackenzie here, and here is our top 10 list of the most important events in United States history. To rank our events, we came up with our own rubric, which we used to grade them on. We based our rubric off of 4 categories: global effects, domestic effects, impact then, and impact now. Each category was worth 5 points. We've also decided to include not only America's greatest moments, but also the tragedies that have shaped us as we know, as they are important as well. Before we begin, please understand that this is strictly how we feel about these events, and it's fine to disagree with us. So, let's get started.
To start our list at number 10, we have the Battle of Gettysburg. After 2 years of fighting, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by General Robert E. Lee, was making another offensive into the Union. The Federal Army of the Potomac served as the force to intercept the advancing forces of the South. Gettysburg served as a major turning point in the Civil War, since it stopped the South's northward invasion, and in conjunction with the simultaneous victory at Vicksburg, swung the tide of the war heavily towards the Union. It was a decisive win for the Union as it pushed Lee back into Virginia, and it made Lee's primary goal of crippling the Union Army and forcing a stalemate impossible. It is known as the bloodiest battle of the Civil War and resulted in about 50,000 casualties. After the battle ended, the South was put on the defensive for the rest of the war and could never regain any strength or receive any recognition. While Fort Sumter in 1861 got the war underway, Gettysburg serves as the Civil War's most important battle, earning its spot on our list.
Passing at number 9 is the passage of Civil Rights Act of 1964. Almost 100 years before its passing in 1868, Congress passed 3 amendments to the Constitution, 13th, 14th, and 15th, to ban slavery, create basic civil rights for all citizens, and voting rights for all citizens. But at the end of Radical Reconstruction, various laws were passed restricting the enforcement of these amendments, most notably Jim Crow laws in the South that created a caste system. As a result of the civil rights protests of the late 1950s and early 1960s, President Kennedy proposed legislation banning segregation and creating a way for the government to enforce the Reconstruction Amendments. In 1964, President Johnson, who made it his goal to pass this through Congress, signed the legislation reinforcing the Reconstruction Amendments and banning discrimination on account of race, religion, national origin, and gender. This piece of legislation had broad consequences for the entire country. With legal segregation ended, the entire South and parts of North faced huge changes as Jim Crow type laws were deemed illegal. This law was the beginning of a full-fledged crusade against discrimination of minorities and was followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Fair Housing Act of 1968, and other laws aimed at ending discrimination of people today.
At number 8, entering in with a boom, we have the tragic event of Pearl Harbor. Before Pearl Harbor, America had claimed to be a neutral country even though it was supplying weapons to the Allies in Europe, while the rest of Europe was yet again in another war. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the Japanese performed a sneak attack on the United States Naval Base in Hawaii and bombed Pearl Harbor, destroying a large amount of the U.S. naval fleet in the Pacific. This action directly brought us into the war, with Congress quickly declaring war on the Axis powers, which included Japan at the time. The result of this was the offensive strategy in the Pacific known as island hopping that allowed the US to defeat Japan, a formal alliance with the UK that led to the defeat of Germany and a way for the United States to get out of the Depression. All of these things led it to find a way on our list.
Buying its way into the 7th spot is the Louisiana Purchase. A little background first, though. After losing the Louisiana Territory to Spain in 1763, Napoleon regained the land in 1802. But seeing the land as a liability and a way to make money, he made a deal with the United States. In 1803, the United States purchased over 827,000 square miles of land from the French for a mere $15 million. Oui, oui. At the time, this was a very controversial move. Thomas Jefferson, president at the time, was in favor of a strict interpretation of the Constitution, like his fellow Democratic Republicans. And in it, nowhere did it say that the president had the power to buy land to double the size of the country. Jefferson weighed his options, though, and realized that buying the land would benefit his vision of America more than adhering to his view of the Constitution. By buying the land, it would allow for countless generations of Americans to move west and live an agrarian lifestyle. It finally allowed for the French to get out of America, and 40 years later give America a reason to undertake the idea of Manifest Destiny with President Polk. The Louisiana Purchase was the first venture in our imperialist journey throughout history.
At number 6, we have the bombing of Hiroshima. It first started with the Manhattan Project in 1939 with the beginning of the development of the first atomic bomb. The United States first started trying to build nuclear weapons over concerns that Nazi Germany was conducting research on the creation of nuclear weapons. In 1941, the United States entered World War II, and by July 1945, there was a successful test of an atomic bomb. On August 6th, an American B-29 bomber dropped the bomb known as Little Boy on the city of Hiroshima. 90% of the city was destroyed, along with killing 80,000 people instantly and tens of thousands more afterwards due to radiation exposure. 3 days later, the U.S. dropped another bomb, Fat Man, on the city of Nagasaki, killing 40,000, which led the Japanese emperor to surrender over fears there would be more. This horrific event led to the ending of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War. It allowed this event to make our top 10 list. Crashing its way into our fifth spot is the stock market crash of 1929. The United States economy had been experiencing major expansion up until August of 1929. Stock prices had begun to fall in September and early October. On October 18, 1929, the fall had begun. This caused a widespread panic throughout America. People had started to rapidly trade in their shares. A last effort was made by investment companies and leading bankers at the time to stabilize the fall, but it was too late. On October 29th, otherwise known as Black Tuesday, the stock market had officially crashed. Millions upon millions of shares were traded, and billions of dollars were lost. This event directly caused the Great Depression, a time where unemployment and poverty plagued the entirety of the U.S. During this depression, banks failed and virtually nothing was done to help it until FDR took office in 1933. It wasn't until the Second World War until the Depression subsided, since it revitalized American industry. The long-lasting economic effects that shattered America is what easily made this event make our list.
Shocking the world at number 4, we have the assassination of President Lincoln. With the coming of the end of the Civil War, Lincoln began to work his way towards peace with the Confederacy. The Confederacy had been losing the war, and by April of 1865, General Lee had surrendered to General Grant. With the end of the war came Reconstruction, and Lincoln was hinting at making it short and led by the offending states and not Congress. But his plans would never be realized. On the night of April 14th, Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth, in an attempt to paralyze the office of the president, shot and killed President Lincoln while he was watching a play. Booth was killed a few weeks later, but the shock of the assassination sent waves through the country, and with Lincoln's death, a completely different America emerged that there would have been had Lincoln survived, putting this event at number 4.
Declaring itself as its own number 3 spot is the signing of the Declaration of Independence. In the years prior to our country's birthday, the American colonists and their British rulers had been in conflict with each other. Britain had abandoned its policy of salutary neglect and asserted its influence even more by passing taxes, searching homes illegally, and making colonists house troops. By 1774, the colonists had had enough and began to resist in an armed and more organized manner. But they did not assert their independence. Rather, they advocated for equal treatment as citizens of the empire. This all changed with the publishing of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776, where the author argued that independence from Britain was inevitable and would happen no matter what. This caused many more Americans to abandon hopes for reconciliation and argue for independence. As a result, the Second Continental Congress convened, and a group of 5 writers, including John Adams and the primary author Thomas Jefferson, drafted the Declaration of Independence, listing all of the grievances that King George III had committed against the colonies. All the signers of the document became traitors and had officially endorsed the rebellion that the people had started. The result is the creation of one of the most influential documents in United States history, along with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and signing it on to the number 3 spot on our list.
At our second spot is likely the greatest tragedy America has ever seen. On September 11, 2001 at 8:45 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York was struck by a hijacked airplane. The collision left a gaping hole near the 80th floor of the 110-story skyscraper. A mere 18 minutes later, a second hijacked plane hit the South Tower, this time just above the 60th floor. It was a surprise attack on American soil carried out by 19 terrorists associated with the Islamic extremist group Al-Qaeda. There were a total of 4 planes hijacked that day, all within a few hours of each other. The third plane hit the Pentagon just outside Washington, D.C. On the fourth plane, the passengers managed to bring down the plane themselves and crashed it in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where all 45 passengers were killed. The towers eventually collapsed, causing the deaths of thousands of trapped Americans. Over 3,000 people lost their lives that day, along with over 400 police officers and firefighters. On top of that, over 10,000 people were injured, and in many cases the injuries were severe. The reason why this tragedy is so high on our list is its presence is still here today. It's still so fresh in the minds of Americans, and to this day we still don't know everything about what happened that day. The families that lost their loved ones are still mourning their losses, and people will likely never forget what happened on that day. Today there is a memorial honoring those who died right where the towers had been, and a museum showcasing the artifacts that survived the attack. Osama bin Laden took responsibility for the event and remained a leading figure within the Middle East. It wasn't until May 2nd, 2011 that he met his demise at the hands of Navy SEALs. The terrorist threat is still alive today, and the United States has to decide whether or not to act. 9/11's immediate shock factor and its influence today is still unmatched.
Before we reveal our first spot on our list, here are some honorable mentions.
And now, for the moment you've all been waiting for. Our most important event in American history is the ratification of the Constitution by the state of New York. Before New York ratified the Constitution, we had just fought in the American Revolution, gaining our independence from Great Britain, and had just signed the Articles of Confederation, creating a loose association between the former colonies. By 1786, though, it was apparent that the Articles of Confederation weren't effective because Congress didn't have the power to tax or really enforce any kind of legislation without a two-thirds majority. With the events of Shays' Rebellion fresh in the minds of the states, Congress decided to revise the Constitution. What came out was the Great Compromise, a balance between equal and population-based representation, along with parameters for the limiting of slavery. But if New York didn't sign the new document, the entire idea would be pointless and ineffective. New York's problem was that it was deeply divided into Federalist and Anti-Federalist groups. So, a group of anonymous writers at the time also wrote the Constitution known today as Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, began to write a series of essays known today as the Federalist Papers. And they put forth the ideas that the Constitution advocated for. Whether or not this had an effect is debatable, but either way, with the publicity gained and some horse trading by Hamilton, the New York state legislature ratified it 30 votes for it, 27 against. New York became the 11th state to ratify the Constitution and solidified the creation of our country. Without the United States Constitution, the America as we know it would be completely different. This event was a huge part of America's birth, which is why it is at the top of our list. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed.
Of civil rights protests of the late 1950s and early 1960s, President Kennedy proposed legislation banning segregation and creating a way for the government to enforce the Reconstruction Amendments. In 1964, President Johnson
made a deal with the United States. In 1803, the United States purchased over 82,700 land. It would allow for countless generations of Americans to move west and live an agrarian lifestyle. You know what, Eric? Why do you say words I can't pronounce?